They have looked at exactly why it is that people don't talk about climate change and what those barriers and hesitations are. And what they found is that we all quite dramatically underestimate the extent to which other people care about these topics. And I think that is as true for brands as it is for you and me talking about this. And so, what I imagine is that there's a perception on the part of brands that their consumers don't want to hear about this stuff, or that they're going to get a huge amount of backlash if they start to raise these topics. And I'm not sure that the data actually backs that up.
Hello, and welcome back to the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. I'm your host, Meg Carney, and I'm an outdoor and environmental writer and author of the book, Outdoor Minimalist, Waste Less Hiking, Camping, and Backpacking. The Outdoor Minimalist podcast has the goal to give listeners actionable ways to waste less hiking, camping, backpacking, and more during every step of their process. Your impact outdoors starts long before you hit the trail and goes beyond leave no trace ethics. You'll learn how to identify sustainable outdoor brands, how to ask hard questions regarding sustainability, and begin to shift and evolve your mindset to integrate minimalism into all of your outdoor pursuits. What is the role that brands should play in our climate change conversations? We see some brands being consistent champions for the planet in their marketing campaigns, but beyond Earth Day, as consumer concern about climate change grows, so does the demand for brands to take an active role, not just in marketing, but in genuine engagement with policy development and community dialogue. Yet many companies still hesitate to make their voices heard. Why is that? And what do consumers truly want from brands? In episode 153 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, we explore how brands can have more meaningful conversations, the importance of aligning actions with values, and how to break through the fear that might be holding some brands back. To help us challenge the status quo and uncover how brands can better connect with consumers who care deeply about the future of the planet, I sat down to chat with Allie Wines. Allie is a communication strategist who helps companies talk about sustainability and climate change. She runs Uncommon Ground Communications, where she works with clients from the ski and outdoor industries, nonprofits, and construction companies to tell their sustainability stories with authenticity and courage. Before starting Uncommon Ground, Allie was the executive director of Protect Our Winters Canada. She's a skier, a dog person, and a mom to two daughters who are faster than her on a mountain bike. So welcome to the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, Allie. I'm excited to have you here and talk about this topic that I've been wanting to for quite some time. But before we get into it, I'm going to ask you my standard question, which is, how did you become interested in outdoor recreation and how does it fit into your life now?
Yeah, great question. Um, so, as you'll pick up pretty quickly, I grew up in Australia. And I was lucky enough to have an aunt that lived in the mountains. And so I had this childhood that was full of horse riding and skiing and water skiing and foraging for mushrooms, which went quite badly at one stage. And so I think, as we get older and we grow into our careers, sometimes you lose touch with a little bit of that. And that was the case for me. But moving to Canada was like this real feeling of homecoming because all of a sudden all that stuff was on my doorstep again, and I was able to go hiking and, introduce my kids to some of the things that I'd really loved growing up. And so now it's just it's part of who we are. It's what we do every weekend. I try as much as I can to have my own outdoor time once a week, so I get to go out there and do the things I like to do.
That's awesome. Yeah, I don't know that much about like the outdoor scene around Toronto, but all the places I've been to in Canada, it seems very accessible.
Yeah, it's a little tougher in Toronto maybe, but if you make the effort, you can still get out there.
Nice. And from our previous conversation, you discussed a little bit being the executive director at Protect Our Winters and that organization. For people that don't know, I might have you explain what it is because I think that's pretty
Yeah.
prominent in the outdoor industry, but some people might not be super aware if they're not into snow sports. But how did that become a part of your life? And then how did you transition into your current consulting work? What kind of like sparked you wanting to work with them and then starting to move away?
Yeah. So, for anyone who doesn't know, Protect Our Winters is a nonprofit initially based in sort of the snow sports industry, but now sort of expanded to the whole of the outdoor community that is really focused on helping outdoor enthusiasts to become climate advocates and using our love of these natural spaces that we spend time in and recreate in to channel action towards climate change to protect them. So I was executive director of Protect Our Winters Canada for a couple of years, and they initially started out as a client. So I had run my own communications consultancy basically from the time we moved to Canada, and POW had become a client. I was given the opportunity to take on the ED role, which was just kind of an incredible and I think life changing opportunity. And I loved so much of it. You really feel in a role like that that you're at the front lines and you have the opportunity to affect some meaningful change. Um, and I think for me, what I know and what I sort of realized is that I'm such a communicator at heart, and that's where my passion is, and that's where I think my skill is. And so I saw a real opportunity for myself to take this huge amount I'd learned at POW about climate advocacy and using fantastic, powerful marketing strategies to bring people into social movements, and to try and translate that for other organizations to bring into their own communication strategies. So it was a really natural, I guess, transition in and then transition back to what I'd always done as well.
Yeah, and so are you continuing that specific type of consulting work now, or how exactly are you helping brands?
Yeah, so I'd always done, I guess, things around the social impact space. And now I'm really focused on sort of that sustainability lane, I guess, if you like, and trying to support brands in two different ways. So, number one, to kind of communicate their sustainability goals in a way that's interesting and effective and maybe moves a bit beyond that check the box compliance style communication that happens a lot in the ESG space. And then also to develop some confidence around climate advocacy and to feel like they have a voice and a role to play in that conversation as well.
Absolutely. And that piece of climate advocacy and how brands can kind of become more involved is kind of the basis of our conversation today. And so, through your work and research that you've done, what are some of the most surprising things that you found regarding brands and kind of their involvement there?
Yeah. So when I first came back into Uncommon Ground, my business, I really wanted to understand what consumer perceptions are around sustainability and climate. I just had this gut feeling that maybe what consumers were thinking and feeling didn't necessarily match up with what the brand's perceptions of that were. So I did a survey and a little bit of a research study to try and understand what it is that outdoor consumers specifically were thinking about climate change. And what really struck me, I think two things was number one, the level of concern. So 92% of respondents reported being very concerned about climate change. And that sort of doesn't even encompass the spectrum of a little bit concerned to very concerned. That's just the people in that very concerned bucket. So it's really high. And then I guess related to that, what really stood out was that these consumers also really expect the brands that they like and trust to take an active stance and to have a voice on climate issues, both in terms of educating their consumer base, but also taking that further and, really playing a bit of an advocacy role. So it was very interesting to see the level of that expectation that's out there for brands.
Yeah, it is interesting to hear from the consumer side, like what do you expect from a brand? And even if we're not thinking about it all of the time, I think a lot of people when they're shopping, they do kind of expect certain things from especially outdoor industry brands. Um, and so what are some of the trends, I guess, that you think the role of brands can play within the climate change conversation? Are there opportunities to make more changes or to use advocacy in different ways?
Yeah, massively. And I think opportunities to make an impact, but also opportunities for the brands to differentiate themselves and to stand out a little bit. One of the big trends that I'm noticing is an evolution, I guess, from the sort of standard sustainability practices of measuring your carbon footprint, looking at those scope one, scope two, maybe scope three emissions, to a real maturation into seeing the role of the brand as an advocate. Yeah, I think maybe Aspen One is a really great example there. So they've actually flagged in one of their more recent sustainability reports that they're going to be moving away from measuring their own carbon footprint. And the reason for that is that partly they see it as playing small, but partly they see it as kind of really playing into that mindset that's been handed down from some of the fossil fuel actors, that climate change is our individual responsibility rather than a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. So they're kind of actively rejecting that narrative, and they're stepping into the advocacy space, working with government representatives, pushing hard on their chambers of commerce, and really inviting their guests into that conversation as well. And there's a number of other brands doing similar things. So I think that's kind of where the space is going. That's where I really see the leading edge of this. And it's pretty cool. It's exciting.
Yeah, it is always exciting when you start to see those changes actually go into action. And there is kind of a domino effect, I think, because other brands can like see that success maybe. And you mentioned Aspen One, but are there some just kind of classic best practices that brands could use for when they are discussing climate change? And you can bring up other brands if you want or you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I think it's just really key that brands know themselves and they know their audience, and that they enter that conversation in a way that makes sense to the people that know that brand. There's a number of examples of people kind of jumping on a hot social topic and it doesn't go well because they haven't thought about how it aligns with who they are as an organization. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be having that conversation. It just means that maybe they didn't plan it out enough in the first place. So I would say doing it in a way that's really authentic to the organization and that makes sense to your consumers is really critical. And perhaps another good example of that, there's a company I like called Seventh Generation, and they make cleaning products, but they have partnered with a nonprofit that is attempting to kind of prevent the capture of government representatives through big oil donations. So the idea is to expose and then prevent kind of these massive multi-million dollar donations from fossil fuel companies to our government representatives. And that's a really logical step for them because they make fossil free products. So there's a really natural kind of A plus B cohesion there, I think, in people's minds about why they would be part of that conversation. So that's the first thing I would recommend to people, is just to think about why you want to participate in this and how you can make the most impact.
Yeah, that's really interesting because climate change is such a broad and kind of like an umbrella term for a lot of other issues that trickle down from the changes in the global temperatures and all of this environmental degradation. So it's interesting to hear like picking out a specific avenue of climate change, I guess, that would align best with your brand makes the most sense. And I could see it's a big, scary topic. It's sometimes divisive, especially in like high political climates like we have in 2024. And so, would those be kind of some of the reasons that brands might hesitate to talk about climate or even sustainability practices? And how do they kind of like push through that?
Yeah, I certainly think that's part of the reason. And our online channels that we're all so much a part of have such a negativity bias. So we see those negative comments. I think there's a really natural and understandable instinct that brands want to protect themselves and protect their reputation. So I think that's a very normal and very human response. Um, but I think also it's driven by there's some really interesting research that's come out. It's done by a group called the Potential Energy Coalition, and they have looked at exactly why it is that people don't talk about climate change and what those barriers and hesitations are. And what they found is that we all quite dramatically underestimate the extent to which other people care about these topics. And I think that is as true for brands as it is for you and me talking about this. And so, what I imagine is that there's a perception on the part of brands that their consumers don't want to hear about this stuff, or that they're going to get a huge amount of backlash if they start to raise these topics. And I'm not sure that the data actually backs that up. So, I would say, for brands thinking about entering into this conversation, do that research, find out what it is that your consumers care about. Do they want you to take a bit of a stance on these issues? And it doesn't mean that you have to go from 0 to 100. You don't have to be kind of out on the steps of the Capitol waving flags, but you might have a bit of a warm up period where you're laying that groundwork, opening the door to the conversation, and just building it from there.
Yeah, and one thing that I see sometimes, depending on the social issue, is that there can be like a negative effect to staying quiet. And oftentimes, if you have really loyal customers or a big following, that people will call you out on that. And I think that that social accountability is important. But um, I guess what are the risks of failing to engage in this conversation at this point in history?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I don't know if I coined this term or if I stole it from someone, but I think of it as beige washing. If you don't stand for anything, it's such a cliche, but you do stand for nothing. And so consumers are wondering who you are as a brand. Most companies have got a nice list of values on their website, and they value integrity and teamwork and the environment. But consumers these days are pretty savvy, and they want to know, what is it that you're actually doing about those topics that you say that you care about. And I think the brands that do that really well are the ones that gain this huge advantage in terms of a deeply loyal following and brand recall, and consumers coming back to them time and again because they're so trusted.
And I think a lot of this, when you're talking about it, I'm thinking a lot about just their general marketing, like their messaging and their copywriting. It could be on social media, the content that they're putting out, or even just their ads that they place. But you also mentioned some examples, like with Seventh Generation partnering with that nonprofit. Is that another way that brands, I guess, could, I don't wanna say like more sneakily, but like more subtly, there we go, that's the word, can more subtly kind of like push for these initiatives and changes without it being like, "Oh, look at me doing this."
Absolutely. Yeah, I think partnering with an organization that A, would so deeply value the resources and support of a for profit company, and B, has the knowledge and the expertise to be the voice on these issues is a fantastic way to go about that. That's certainly a model that Protect Our Winters has operated on, and I think quite successfully. Other things I think that brands can do is just to recognize that they probably have more influence than they realize, both economically and in that sort of expertise space. So, policymakers are, their number one concern is always the economy. And so, if you can go in as someone that employs people and brings money into the communities that these folks are representing, you're really going to have an impactful voice, and you can help with bringing your knowledge and expertise on particular topic areas to those people. So, an outerwear manufacturer might know a lot about the chemicals that it takes to waterproof a particular item. So, you can work with policymakers who are, kind of trying to address some of the pollution and climate related issues there by just presenting them with some information as you see it, how it affects your industry, how it affects the people who work for you, that sort of thing. Or, maybe you're a tourism operator and you know that transit is the main source of emissions in your industry. You can't control that within your own business, but maybe what you can do is to play an active role in advocating for sustainable transit or EV infrastructure. And you don't have to do that in a really public way. It might just be a knock on the door of your local representative and saying, hey, we have something to contribute here.
Yeah, I love those examples. What would you say for a media brand or like a large outdoor media company would be a
Ooh,
good
that's a
example? Because I feel like they're already talking about so many things, but I think I don't want to call out any specific ones, but oftentimes they kind of, yeah, they still do the beige washing, as you say.
that's yeah, it's a really great question because media are so, by the very nature of what they do, so public and so sort of in the face of the outdoor consumer. I think for me, that's where a real courage comes in to have that voice and to back it up with those actions. There's lots of media companies now, lots of conversations in the media and communications industry about not being involved in greenwashing and taking an active stance against it. There's groups like Clean Creatives, which I'm a part of, which refuse to take on any fossil fuel clients. There's other groups that are sort of really working on the communication theory to help media organizations talk about climate in a way that's more engaging and actually connects with people and doesn't kind of send them running for the hills. So, finding a way to participate in those groups in a way that's authentic and impactful, I think is not just kind of desirable, but actually really essential.
Yeah, the more that people are talking about it in like an understandable and not fear-mongery way, I could see that being really important. If you've enjoyed listening to this interview and any of our other interviews on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, we'd love to hear from you. One super easy and free way to support our content is by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts. We thank you for listening to and supporting our work so that together we can create a better outdoor space as we recreate. You mentioned earlier some of the research that you did around like consumer perception. And so would you mind going into a little bit more detail about kind of what consumers exactly expect in terms of communication about sustainability and climate action and like what they want more of from a brand, regardless of what their brand is?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think there's probably two parts to that. The sustainability part, I think consumers are just now so much more educated than they were, 10 or even 5 years ago. And that probably engenders a little bit of skepticism. So they might see these big, bold claims from brands and they're really wondering, is this actually backed up by tangible action? And I think that's really what they want to see. And so for brands, making sure that you're backing that up with details, numbers, plans, things that are actually someone can look at and say, okay, they're doing something. That's kind of the really critical piece. I think the other piece of it as well is transparency is so critical. No sustainability program is going to go perfectly according to plan. You're always going to have obstacles, you're going to have delays in progress. And people know that, and it's okay to talk about that. In fact, I think it's a really fantastic opportunity to build trust with your consumers through that sort of almost radical transparency. So letting people know, hey, we messed up here a little bit, or hey, we thought we'd have this done by now and we haven't, but here's why and here's what we're doing to fix it, is a really great way to overcome that level of skepticism. And then on the climate side, I think consumers are really seeing brands almost as a channel for their own concerns. And we didn't dive into the why of that in this particular piece of research, but my gut feeling is that all of us as individuals kind of feel pretty powerless against this kind of huge behemoth of change that we're facing. And we see brands, and especially maybe the larger corporations, as being a lot more influential and a lot more powerful. And so I think people look to them to be their voice on these matters and to reflect their concerns in that more systemic way.
Yeah, and I guess what would be if you had to pick one piece of advice or one action that brands could enact to enhance that communication and really like give consumers what they're looking for, what would it be?
I think the very best thing that you can do is know your consumer and don't talk about something just because you think it's going to be popular. Equally, don't hold back from talking about it because you've made the assumption that people want you to be silent on this issue. My piece of advice would be really get to know your audience and understand what it is they want to hear from you and respond to that in a way that's authentic to your brand. There's companies and brands out there that do it so well. National Park Service, Wendy's have these fantastic kind of social media presence. It doesn't mean you have to do it like them. It just means you should do it in a way that is authentic to you and builds a really meaningful connection with your consumers, builds a community around your values and the things that you're trying to achieve through your sustainability efforts.
Awesome. Yeah, do you have anything else that you would like to add? That's most of what I had for questions.
Yeah. I would just say there's probably there's probably a lot of people out there who feel like they're a small fish in a big pond, and maybe they work for some of these organizations, but they're not the decision maker, or they don't know where to begin with getting these climate conversations started. I would really encourage those people, don't be deterred. There's really powerful ways that you can build a case to start these kinds of conversations within your own organization. And if anyone would kind of like to chat about that, I'm very open to having that conversation. I don't think, you know, you can be the youngest person, the newest person on the bench, you can be the oldest person in the finance department. It doesn't matter. All of us have a role to play. And I think just to embrace that.
Yeah, and if people do want to get in contact with you to discuss this type of communication, what's the best way to do that?
Website is probably best. So it's just we are uncommon with a little hyphen between each of the words, .com. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, the kind of usual channels. So yeah, very happy to have chats with people and connect in that way.
Awesome. And I'll be sure to link to all of that in the show notes so people can easily contact you or find one of your social channels. But with that, Allie, thank you so much for sharing all those insights.
Amazing. Thanks so much for having me, Meg.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.